we're the dads and granddads or fathers, going to be fathers. Can I just see you a minute? This is my 40th Father's Day at Ginghamsburg Church. So now, to my sisters in Christ out there, I always say the same thing for 40 years. Is it okay today if I just speak to the men, right? How many of you remember me saying that? Is it okay? Okay, I still have permission, but it applies equally, but I'm going to address it to the men today. We are in a second week of an 8-week series on the book of Esther, Old Testament book, 10 chapters in Esther. The overarching theme is for such a time as this. My focus today is dads, men, positioned for good and partnered with God. Tuesday morning, I was this week speaking in Shreveport, Louisiana at a conference, and I woke up early in my hotel room, as is my custom, in a spirit of contemplation and prayer, meditation on the Word. And so this one passage, you know how when you can read passages hundreds of times, but then you notice something new? I was reading about Barnabas in the book of Acts. Now, all of us are positioned for good and partnered with God to be influencers in the lives of others. So Barnabas mentored and coached the Apostle Paul, who wrote most of the books of the New Testament. Now, here's what it said about Barnabas. Barnabas was a good man. And man, I got hooked right there. A good man, full of the Holy Spirit and faith. Now, notice the expanse of his influence, and a great number of people were brought to the Lord. Now, I was thinking about that good man. Too many times we use the word good to be kind of the same as nice, but the word good in English is a derivative of God. So when we say good, we say God. So God-man, or if we say it's a good business, then what we mean when we use that word, whether we understand it or not, it is a God business. It gives glory to God. And so I was thinking about that. What does it mean to be a man of God? And men, I think this is a great day that we celebrate in our country, where we really ask ourselves some real serious questions like, who or what do I reflect in my values, my priorities, my behaviors? Do others recognize God in me, or do they see something else? Now, what is unique about this book, a little bit of review, Pastor Rachel mentioned this last week. It is the only book out of 66 books in the Bible that never mentions God. God is mentioned nowhere in this book. But what we see, this is how God makes God's self known, is that God positions people to be God's voice of purpose and promise in the lives of other people. Now, every one of you who are here today are here. The only reason you would come, even if you're in some kind of stage, you're not sure about this God thing, but you're here because someone else influenced you, right, to be here. Someone else was a God influencer in your life. And I would just like for you to take a moment. Do it in silence. If you're with somebody, share with them, name some God influencers in your life. And if you're not, maybe you're taking notes or something, just take silently a moment to identify some of those God influencers. Go ahead and do that. So Nathan, you thinking about this? God influencers? It's good. Now, why I thought of several, and a lot of times it is a string of God influencers. I had a scoutmaster, elementary school, probably 7th grade. His name was Ted Palin, and he was a young Procter & Gamble executive in Cincinnati. They had a baby. He had a MG, which I thought was cool. But, you know, he shared, we in the morning, he did a lot of campouts, and we would sit around the campfire, and he would read the Bible and share his own experience of God. And when he came into our Methodist church, he did something that I thought only Catholics did. He knelt at the pew before worship started in prayer, and that had an influence on my life. Dale Renner, isn't it amazing? I remember these names. He was my 6th grade teacher, and he was a committed Christian that shared his faith, and came to my house and gave me piano lessons. But there was always this sense that he was a man of God. Mr. and Mrs. Aleo, they were our youth counselors in high school, and they were kind of like that early marriage stage, lived in an apartment. He had a Corvette, which I also thought was cool. See, these people imprint, man. I had a love of sports cars. So Carolyn wasn't allowed to go. I was a sophomore or freshman. She was a junior or senior because her parents thought it was too risque. But they took us, the youth group, to that movie. It was at that time mature audiences. Some of you remember the first Alfie movie, and it was kind of like free sex and everything else. But we went back to their apartment, and they talked to us about the sanctity of sexuality and the uniqueness of our sexuality and how it's created for this special, unique relationship. And then there was Mrs. Cook, who in 7th grade, I've shared about her before, said, when you grow up, you either have to be a doctor or a minister. Well, my grades figured that one out. My grades figured that out. But you see, our position of influence can either work for good or evil. Now, men, what I want us to look at, and Pastor Rachel, you gave me this passage about three weeks ago. This is the 2nd week, right, of these 8 weeks. She gave me this challenging passage that I've really prayerfully over the last 3 weeks have struggled with. And men, what I see in this is it's a contrast between 2 men. And one of them, Xerxes, who was king of the Persian Empire, and this is about time period 460s, 480s BC. This is the Persian Empire ruled the world at that time, the known world. And he really represents our false self. And all of us I still go back to that place. Now, men, this is not to induce guilt. It's just to understand this process of transformation that God has us in so that we can truly be positioned for God's purpose and influence of those around us. But Xerxes was driven by pleasure and power, and it's so easy to get caught up into that. And if you look at the first chapter, verses 1 through 4, it talks about the expanse of his empire. And it says in the 3rd verse, that first chapter, it says, in the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a banquet for all of his nobles and officials and the military leaders and the nobles for a full 180 days. Now, what a party. Yeah. Right? That's like 6 months. Right. That's worse than I was in college. 180 days he displayed the vast wealth of his kingdom and the splendor and glory of his majesty. I mean, look at what he valued, materialism. Look at what I have. He measured his value based on what he had. And then jump over to the 2nd chapter, verses 2 through 4. It says his king's personal attendants said, let's a search be made for beautiful young virgins for the king. Let the king appoint commissioners in every province of this realm to bring all these beautiful young women to the harem. This is sexual slavery, folks. This is sexual trafficking, what this is, but it's slavery. And then we jump down to the 4th verse. It says, let the young women who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti, This advice appealed to the king, and he followed it. And what I want us to see here, it is so easy for us to get caught up in being slaves to materialistic values or lust. Now, you know, to me, and some of the Christian sisters I talk to aren't surprised, but the number of prominent men who appeared to be men of integrity, I mean, from all different kinds of fields, actors, directors, news anchors, they appeared to be men of integrity, but they were exposed for years of sexual harassment and abuse. So, men, what we had to be aware of is there's some Xerxes in all of us. Talk about one of the struggles I have when we use this expression, make America great again. I said, let's make America better. Because even founding fathers perpetrated sexual slavery. Here, Thomas Jefferson, I mean, he's a hero in our culture. This are descendants. He had children with his slaves. So we're seeing, and they have a family reunion every year, but we're seeing the same thing. We all have the potential, men. We've got to name these things as we continue to work out our salvation in fear and trembling, as the word says. I saw on the news the other day that if you take all the social media websites, Facebook, all the others, that the websites of internet pornography together beat all of the others. Now, anytime we are tempted, men, and we all deal with lust, no one's exempt from this. Anytime we are tempted to click onto internet pornography, we are participating in sex trafficking. I mean, what we see in Xerxes is this ego. Look at the 4th verse again, this of the 1st chapter. You know, look at all my stuff. Look at all my stuff. And ego, edging God out. That's what that stands for. Where we see everything in life, we're the center of all of the meaning in life. And so we have to ask ourselves, when people look at us, what are we promoting? Are we promoting our stuff? Are we promoting ourselves? Look at so much of Facebook where it's really self kind of promotion. Or are we promoting Christ in us and through us? Now, men, I asked Carolyn, I don't know where Carolyn is right now. She's been in the other worship services. I asked her at the last service, have you ever seen explosive anger in me? It's a dangerous question to ask when your wife's in. And I said, have we ever seen it in you? And she agreed, we both. But you see that same thing in the 2nd chapter, 1st verse, later when King Xerxes' fury had subsided. Now, what that is about is control and the expectation of others being obedient to my wishes. And his problem, 1st chapter, 10th verse, says, on the 7th day when King Xerxes was high in spirits from wine, he commanded. Now, this dude was an alcoholic. And he commanded, his wife was beautiful, so he commanded her to appear at his 6-month party to display her beauty. And she says, I'm not going to put up with this nonsense. That's healthy, right? So many Christian men have totally out of context taken that verse, wives, be submissive to your husbands as to the Lord. That's sick. Folks, I'm positioned in Carolyn's life not to control Carolyn, but to serve Carolyn. Amen. That's my purpose. You know, I'm there to do nothing but serve her and let her see what it means for her to be a beautiful, intelligent daughter of God. A couple Carolyn and I have worked with in ministry, and I'm saying for over 40 years, now in their late 50s. Empty nesters, 30 years of marriage. Husband comes home, and both highly professional people, and says to his wife that he met an old girlfriend from a class reunion he went to, and he wants a divorce because she no longer meets his emotional needs. Do you know it's not Carolyn's position to meet my emotional needs? Regardless of what I'm experiencing in life, it is the Lord, right, who meets my emotional needs. Now, I'm a social work major, and so, I had a lot of psychology and stuff, and I always look back at Freud's 5 stages of psychosexual development. Who kind of studied Freud at any point? Well, what he said in that first stage, the first year, the primary source of, how do I say it, dealing with the anxiety. You had everything you needed in the womb, perfect temperature control, food, everything you needed. Now you're thrown out to this thing. We have a new baby that's 4 weeks old tomorrow. Do I have a picture of my new baby? This is Tessa Jillian. So it's Jonathan and Stacy's fourth. And, she can't control her hand. I know normally she has little gloves on and stuff, so she doesn't scratch her. It's this kind of stage. And what is this, world where they don't have, control of anything? So it's interesting that their primary source of comfort is mouth, is what he says. So what do we call it? Pacifier. Now, men, this is really helpful to know this, because if some of the stuff that we're dealing with now when we get hung up, sisters, you can relate to this too. What do we go for? We're stressed, so we eat when we're not hungry. It's how we deal with the stress of our environment. Smoke. When we get nervous or whatever, I just was sitting out in front of the hotel in Shreveport waiting for a ride to the airport, and I was sitting at one of those bistro tables, and a woman was there, 73, she was smoking. She told me she was a pastor's wife, but her husband died 3 years ago, and she hadn't smoked since she was 45. She was doing one after another, but her son was just diagnosed with brain cancer. So her sister smoked. She asked her for a cigarette. You see how do you deal? Over drinking, alcoholism. You see, so men, it's important for us to understand where this stuff comes from, that it has an origin, and when we name it, then we're allowed for God to continue that healing process in our life. It's that part, yes, we're saved, but the Word says continue to work out your salvation in fear and trembling. Now, the second stage, Freud called, and it's ages 1 to 5, had to deal with the potty training years. And it's really dependent on how your parents approached it. So if there was conflict, are there any young parents that remember the struggle of potty training? Anyone going through potty training right now? Okay. So this is important, parents, just to hear. So if there's conflict in that, and see, I remember that because I have 2 memories of being in a crib. One was at my grandparents' house, and they put this little Santa thing in the crib. And the other was in the crib at my parents' house, where there was a chart when I was going through, and a monthly chart. And if I was dry, I got one of those sticky stars. And if I was wet, they colored it black with me, watching it. So if there's conflict, it can result in rigidity and control. So that's important for me to recognize, because, see, I have to have an environment that is like all put together. Like, I like change, but my house, man, it can't be a mess. It can't, neat. And it helps me understand that. So sometimes when I say to Carolyn, your stuff is go back to the dirty diaper. Now, but the opposite, see, that's rigidity and control. The opposite can be true, is that a person lives in kind of a constant state of disorganization. And he says it goes, back to how that was handled. So, I call this the Peter Pan syndrome, men, where we never really grow up. And a lot of you sisters tell me, well, my husband expects me to be his mother. Can any of you relate, to what and not that we intend it, men, but sometimes we just kind of looked at our wives, which is way different, but we look at them as kind of a replacement. Even if we're not conscious of that, but we kind of look at them as a replacement. That's our false self. And I'm still go back to that stuff, but I'm getting better the older I get. Now Mordecai, who you're going to hear more about from Pastor Rachel as this continues, is driven by purpose and his God identity. Now, Mordecai had a Jewish identity, so he was one that was taken captive in this Persian Empire to Susa, but his Jewish identity reminded him that he was part of the chosen people of God. And he was chosen to be partnered with God for God's good, right? In speaking and demonstrating God's purpose and promise in the life of others, as we'll see he'll do in his adopted daughter, who was his cousin, Esther, as the weeks go on. Now, what was so important is when you hold on, men, to that God identity, you're always aware of who you are by knowing whose you are. Man, it's all over my body, back and front, so that, people even have to ask me. It's a reminder of whose I am. I am not my own. So that for my children, I think, God, let me be who you need me to be and who my children believe me to be. That there's no duplicity. See, I still go back some. So for Mordecai, he's able to demonstrate the visionary and loving heart of God the Father for his cousin Esther. He's positioned in her life as an example, a protector, and a voice of God's purpose. So look with me, if you're following me, 2nd chapter, 5th verse. Now there was in the citadel of Susa a Jew of the tribe of Benjamin named Mordecai. He'd been carried into exile from Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. Mordecai had a cousin named Hadassah, that's Hebrew for Esther, whom he had brought up because she had neither father nor mother. This young woman, who was also known as Esther, had a lovely figure and was beautiful. That's dangerous in this culture she lives in because she was one taken in sexual slavery. But Mordecai had taken her as his own daughter when her father and mother died. Now look at the 10th verse. Esther had not revealed her nationality and family background because Mordecai had forbidden her to do so. See, he's positioned as protector. Every day he walked back and forth near the courtyard of the harem. Man, that's a terrible word. To find out how Esther was and what was happening to her. See, man, what we need to remember in our true self is, man, we all deal with lust. Every one of us. No one escapes this thing. But when we're driven by purpose and God's identity, lust is overcome by the love of God and others. Now, I've put this graphic together to kind of show the difference, and let's keep this up here. The false self is really all that stuff we've talked about: ego, using others, lust, hurts, judgment. But the process here is why Jesus said you must be born again. See, unless there is death to the old, there can't be new. But the problem is, too many of us think, okay, I've been born again. That's all it is to it. No, if anyone is in Christ, they're a new creation. That's like a 4-week-old baby. You're born again, but you're a new creation. The old has passed away. The new has come. We didn't bring Tessa home from the hospital 4 weeks ago and set her on the kitchen table and say, kid, there's the fridge. Anytime you get hungry, help yourself. Man, this thing's a process. This transformation, I have been in this, man, for 50-some years of my 67 years in this process of transformation. Now, man, here's what we have to remember. 1 Corinthians 13:11, Paul said, hey, when I was a child, I thought like a child. I acted like a child. I prioritized as a child, but when I became a man, I gave up childish ways. I want to tell you, it was a lot better being a kid when other people wiped my behind and did all that other kind of stuff. You know, when I didn't have to worry because my parents made a living, I never wondered if there was food on the table, right? I complained about the liver and stuff. Yeah. So we all go back and forth, but we have to realize the power of the Spirit and the responsibility, right? Yes, we're saved, but continue to work out your salvation in fear and trembling. And that's why when we're aware of this stuff, like ego, here's when I recognize it in myself. Ego, you know, edging God out when I think everything is about me. Hey, today's Father's Day. Why am I grilling? Or the real truth is my son just called and said his basement's flooding. I got to go home and change clothes and get all the way to the other side of Cincinnati to help with a flooded basement. And I'll probably have to buy the vac thing, even though he's a surgeon. We use people for our purpose. Wait, this is one of the things. You understand this as a successful businessman. So many times, so many of the young staff who have come out of here are doing excellent. Tony's doing excellent in his church. Pastor Nick is starting a brand new church down in South Carolina. Just great things. Now, these are I felt like, you know, I was managing the New York Yankees. This was it. But my job is not to use them for my purpose, but position by God for the good in their purpose. Wade, do you know how this is with great staff? You know, and for us to help name God's promise and purpose for their life. So we serve instead of use. I'm tempted sometimes to use. That was a great team. Lust, well, obviously, the opposite of that. We all experience it. But when I recognize that in my life, it's my identity of loving God and loving others. We hurt, and not all the time do we realize we hurt. We do, though, when we do things like gossip and so forth, rather than heal. Like men, my job today is not to make you feel guilty, but to help promote ongoing healing in your life. And we judge. I mean, the church can be one of because people don't grow up, they should be on solid food, Paul said, but you're still on milk. You know, you don't vote like I do. Right? You don't believe exactly like I do. Like, man, I was in the late 60s, early 70s in this powerful Jesus movement at the University of Cincinnati. I mean, we were having impact. Now, all of a sudden, we have differences about, do you speak in tongues or don't you speak in tongues? If you don't have the whole thing, if you don't speak in tongues, and it split and took the power right out of it. See, folks, we are better, we are deeper when we're together with differences. And here's the other. Men, to have grace for yourselves. You know, to realize we all fall down. We all fail. So not just to be an instrument of grace for other people, but to be a vehicle of grace in your own life.